conversation if you're following me there. But I want to have a conversation about the economic impact. Hi, YouTube. Welcome, welcome. I want to have a conversation today on the Lurie Daniel Favor Show on SiriusXM's Urban View about the realities of convincing poor white people to work against their economic best interests. And we're going to just use one example today. And that's one of the examples that came out in the executive orders that CODIS in Chief 4547 signed into law or signed into existence on his first day in office. And I want to have this conversation about healthcare and economics, but I want to look at something that happened a long time ago that sort of set the stage for all of this. Now, you guys know on this show, we Sankofa here. We actually had a caller, was it yesterday? Maybe the day before yesterday? I can't remember. But they were basically asking, why do I spend so much time talking about history? And my response to them was because history, you said it was yesterday, Amina? Okay, yesterday. Yes, from Ohio. Shout out to you. But we had a caller who basically was frustrated that we spend a lot of time talking about history on this show. And then I, be frustrated because we ain't gonna stop. But history is important because here we don't just use phrases like, if you don't know your history, you're destined to repeat it. We use African-centered principles. And one of the African-centered principles that we focus on here is the Sankofa principle. And Sankofa, which is spelled Sankofa, Sankofa is a principle out of the Adinkra symbol system. And it's a symbol of a bird that's walking in one direction, but the bird's head is turned back in the direction from which it came, and the bird has an egg in its mouth. And the way my elders raised me in the movement to understand it was that egg represents the bird's origins, its beginnings, its origin story. And the idea behind the symbol is that you cannot understand where you are today. You certainly cannot plan for where you want to go tomorrow if you don't understand the path that brought you to your current position. So we're going to talk about a little bit of Medicare before Imani Gandhi joins us, and followed by Maurice Mitchell for our guest today. We're going to talk a little bit about Medicare, but we're going to talk about Medicare in 2025 and healthcare in 2025 by looking at what was happening in the late 1600s, because all of these things are connected. I want to remind you all about this quote from Lyndon B. Johnson, who presciently said that if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. I will combine that quote with a sentiment that former President Bill Clinton uttered after the most recent election, where he talked about the fact that if you were white and grew up poor like he did in a place like Arkansas, and the only thing you could count on was that no matter how bad your life as a poor white person would be, you weren't black and they had it worse than you, then when you see black people doing better than you and you don't have a context for it, it can feel like something was taken from you, like part of your birthright was taken from you. Now, black folks, I know you might be wondering, why are we spending this time talking about this? Because if we don't understand white psyche, then we're not going to understand what it is that we're grappling with today, right? So I want to talk a little bit about Bacon's Rebellion. I mentioned this incident in American history a lot because it really has a lot to do with why poor white people do not vote in their economic best interest and instead choose to vote in their white supremacist interest, even though voting as a white supremacist is going to undermine their economic sustainability. So Nathaniel Bacon, this is the end of the 1600s. Nathaniel Bacon was a grimy young dude. Like he was sent from Europe because he ain't had no discipline. His daddy was like, you were no good, who ain't gonna do good for nothing, and we gonna send you over to the New World. Because that's what a lot of people would do. You would send your undesirables to the New World because you ain't had nothing for them in England. And so you would send them to the New World hoping that they would figure it out. And Nathaniel Bacon was one of those people. And he had the benefit of also being the cousin of the governor of Virginia. Now, remember, Virginia wasn't a state at this time. Virginia was a business, because America started as a variety of businesses that claimed land and came together. Nathaniel Bacon was the cousin of the governor of Virginia, Mr. Lord Berkeley. And Nathaniel Bacon and Lord Berkeley, they started off all right. Like Lord Berkeley was like, all right, young boy, you here, I'm going to give you a little bit of land. I guess I should use a different voice. All right, young man, you are here. I'm going to give you some land and I'm going to allow you to farm because your father says you are a ne'er-do-well. And because you are a ne'er-do-well, I am going to do what I can to help you while you're here. They were cousins by marriage. It wasn't no long love between the two of them, but it is what it is. But so Nathaniel Bacon, he's here and he's got different perspectives on how things should be run as compared to his cousin, who was, again, the governor of the state of Virginia. And Nathaniel Bacon was like, you see all this land out here? I know you just gave me some free land, but I want more. And I know that the indigenous people, the natives, the Indian people, as they were called then, they're on the land. And I know technically it's their land, but I want it. And because I want it, I think we should go get it. Now, Lord Berkeley was like, hey, now, hold on. we can't do all this warfare. And one, we don't have the militia, we don't have the weapons to really navigate what's happening with what's taking land. And then two, I'm the governor of just Virginia. I'm not just the governor for you, Bacon. I got to think about beyond just you. I got to think about what's good in the best interest of this business that I'm trying to run, called the colony of Virginia. Now they clashed a lot because Bacon was like, yeah, I'm not with that. Like, I want the land. The Indians are on the land. I'm gonna go take the land. And so all these skirmishes start fighting. Like, Bacon was a troublemaker. He was a messy young dude, messy young dude. And so they end up in this conflict where Bacon is like, hey, if you don't let me get this land from the Indians, I'm just gonna take it. And who gonna check me, boo? Because he understood what was coming. And so essentially a lot of skirmishes take place. We're not even going to get into the fact that, like, then the colonists were they got attacked by one nation of indigenous people. And then they thought they were retaliating, but they ended up retaliating against a different band of indigenous nation people. And so they started wars with people they didn't even know they were starting war with, because they weren't that bright, because they don't study and they don't read. Putting that to the side, Nathaniel Bacon is like, I need to take this land. I need people to help me take this land. Oh, look, there's all these people who don't have anything to do, who are not being properly utilized. I'm going to utilize them to form them into a militia. Now, the people he was talking about were poor white people who were indentured servants, and Black people, some of whom might have been slaves, some of whom might have been indentured, because at this point in the 1600s, slavery wasn't a guaranteed position for Black people. It was becoming presumptive that you would be at least enslavable if you had Black skin. But at this point, it wasn't quite a one-to-one correlation. You were Black, you were enslaved. That came a little bit more as America claimed more freedom for itself and stole more freedom from African people. But again, if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pockets. Give him something to look down upon and he'll empty his pockets for you. So indentured servants were you were usually poor white people who had signed a contract, or whose parents signed a contract on their behalf that basically would give them room, board, and travel money to get from England, where there were no jobs. There was a lot of pestilence, a lot of germs, no soap, no hygiene, not a whole lot of food security. They would leave the ghettos of Europe and they would come to the new land under this contract that would cause them to work for a number of years. Now, in the early colonial era, according to a number of reports, indentured servants would come to the English colonies and they would work for maybe 5 to 7 years. And then after they worked, they would get a plot of land and they would get some seeds, and then they would be able to go off and become farmers in the new land, completely remaking themselves from the impoverished criminals that they may have been back at home. But indentured servants were still poor. And then you had this growing class of Africans who were captured, who also had sort of an indenture, but by the 1640s, 1650s, with a couple of key court cases that we're not going to talk about right now, basically it was becoming more and more likely that if you were Black, you were going to be, if you weren't enslaved, you were at least enslavable. And so enslaved Africans were a free labor class. And according to, if I'm a rich white person and I have to make a cost benefit analysis, I could invest a lot of money to bring your white European behind from Europe and have you work my farm. You probably weren't going to work that well because you weren't coming from people who had any agricultural genius whatsoever. And you were going to come here and then you were going to be gone in like 7 years, which means I, as a wealthy white, cannot depend, or I'm sorry, at this point, I was a wealthy European. They hadn't become white yet, because whiteness is a thing that was created, and we'll get to that on another day. But if I'm thinking about my investments, it's a better financial investment for me to purchase enslaved Africans who are never going to be guaranteed a free plot of land, who are never going to be guaranteed freedom. Hell, even the indentured servants, they even had laws back in England that determined how cruel you could be to them, right? There were limits to what you could do to an indentured servant who had white parentage back home, but you could do anything to an enslaved African who could not ever envision going back to their homeland. And so as a white, wealthy person, I wanted more enslaved Africans than I wanted indentured servants, because enslaved Africans were a better return on investment. Let's get back to Nathaniel Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon was like, hey, I am going to get these poor white people and these Black people who are in these weird, maybe you're a slave, maybe you're not, but we're going to come together and we're going to go take this land from the indigenous people. It was one of the first efforts of what we would now, I guess, call interracial organizing. Now, the purposes obviously were nefarious, but it was interracial organizing. What was so challenging about it was that it was really successful. It was a really successful effort. They had Governor Lord Berkeley like on his heels, like he was trying to hold things together. Like the Bacon's Rebellion people weren't just taking indigenous land, they were also threatening the held properties of the colony of Virginia, which is mean they were threatening American, well, I guess it wasn't American yet. They were threatening business interests. They were threatening the flow of the money. Now, ultimately, Nathaniel Bacon was taken down. They weren't ultimately fully successful. He ends up dying like a month after the rebellion. He had like body lice and all this. They don't bathe. The body lice, or they didn't. They didn't bathe, body lice and all sorts of other germs and disease. And so he dies like a month after the rebellion's peak. But what happened was that white people, European Americans at that point, freaked the hung out. Okay, they freaked out because it was like, wait a minute. I am about to buy a whole lot of Africans who are going to be working on my plantation for the rest of their lives. These indentured servants and these Africans, they can't be working together. And yet I, as a rich white person, recognize that these poor white people and these enslaved Africans got a hell of a lot more in common than they do with me. And that was a problem, right? And so we learned from articles like The Politics of Poor Whiteness, where Southern poor whites were a real problem for rich white people, because if you're Southern and you're poor, you don't want a free class of labor because that's your job. And basically Africans were enslaved in such a way that they replaced the working labor class, the economy of poor white people. But if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Give him someone to look down upon and he'll empty his pockets for you. And so white wealthy people had to do a number of things to convince poor white people that they should support enslavement, even though enslavement of African people was directly undercutting poor white people's ability to have economic sustainability. According to the article, the master class deliberately denied a system of public education to the white masses because keeping voters poor, keeping white people poorly educated and ill-informed was one major way of defending the status quo. Merritt writes that for slaveholders that knew poor whites, access to information would eventually lead to greater discontent. Keep them stupid, keep them poorly educated, they won't fight too well. They won't fight for their economic interests because they're too busy fighting over the fact that they get to not be Black. Okay. Poor whites remained illiterate. For the relatively few who could read, vigilant censorship kept incendiary materials out of their hands. The monitoring of strange visitors to the region who might have supported abolitionist sentiments limited poor white people's exposure to subversive ideas antithetical to the slave regime. They had the Fox News of that day. Capture their imagination, tell them that they're, no matter how bad their lives are, they're better than everybody else because they're white and they could be Black. And that's all you need. You don't have to give them health care. You don't have to give them jobs. You don't have to give them houses. You don't have to give them dental care. You don't have to give them grocery prices lower. You don't have to give them lower gas prices. Just shut them up by telling them it's okay. You don't have to have anything that you actually need because you're white and you could be Black. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Give him someone to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. This week, Donald Trump signed a variety of executive orders, one of which is really going to potentially negatively impact not just white economies, but white health. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's important that we have these Sankofa analyses so that we can understand where we're going. One of the executive orders that Donald Trump signed rescinded former President Joe Biden's executive order 14087, and that was put in place to lower the cost of prescription drugs for American people, right? And this was important because remember, people were paying like $400 a month for insulin, and they lowered $35. People were paying hella money for a whole lot of drugs that their lives depended upon. And then the Biden-Harris administration put into place provisions that were going to allow those costs to lower. The key provisions of the executive order that President Biden had put into place made a Medicare $2 drug list model effective. And this was an initiative that capped certain generic drug prices at $2 for Medicare beneficiaries, which made it way more affordable for people. They had a cell and gene therapy access model, which was designed to provide access to high-cost therapies for Medicaid recipients. And this was going to basically basically be a model that was going to allow for renegotiating pricing and facilitating coverage. They had an accelerated clinical evidence model, which was going to expand and expedite the availability of effective treatments, meaning you were going to get healthier, you were going to get more medical care, you were going to get better quality care for who you are, for your family, for your community. And when President Biden signed that executive order, he said too many Americans face challenges paying for prescription drugs. On average, Americans pay 2 to 3 times as much as people in other countries for prescription drugs, and 1 in 4 Americans who take prescription drugs struggle to afford their medications. 3 in 10 American adults who take these drugs say that they have skipped doses, cut pills in half, or not filled prescriptions due to costs. Now, the part of the impact of that is that we are now in a reality where Donald Trump came in and he was like, well, there are things I'm going to undo. One of the things he undid was this executive order. And he says Donald Trump, the previous administration, has embedded deeply unpopular, inflationary, and illegal and radical practices in every agency and office of the federal government. No, he reduced the cost of healthcare. He made it easier for people to get access to the drugs that they needed. And now we are in a moment where Donald Trump has signed these executive orders that is essentially going to undo the work of providing healthcare. It's going to undo the work of providing better cost options for people, most of whom are white. White Americans, righteous, and others. You are going to have an opportunity in this era to really ask yourselves, is it worth it? Like, is it worth being white for you to sacrifice everything else that your communities rely upon just so that you cannot be Black? And it may be that that is a worthwhile decision for you. And if so, go with God, go with white Jesus. I'm sure there is plenty of heaven available in the white side of the line. For everybody else, however, we have to be clear about the ideology that is driving the way that fellow Americans are navigating and operating throughout this world. We have to be clear about this ideology that says, for many of them, they have since the days of Bacon's Rebellion, when they were convinced to support a free labor class, slave labor, in a way that fundamentally undermined them and permanently locked them into the lowest rungs of American economic status. If that was effective then, I want you to think about what is happening in the average white psyche today. I want us to think about that because we're going to have to decide how we move forward. We're going to have to decide, in light of the executive orders and in light of all the things that are about to come down the pike, we're going to have to figure out what's going to be in our best interest, recognizing that for far too many white Americans, if they have been convinced as part of white Americanity, that they are better than the best of us, then they won't notice that the billionaires are picking their pockets because they have us to still look down upon in their own minds, which have been intentionally made stupid by policies that favor diseducation and miseducation. Then they will open up their pockets for the billionaires to take. So we can stop asking, why do white people not vote in their best interest? Because they are voting in their white interests. It just so happens that usually voting in your best white interest is completely undermining to your economic interests. However, I would also add that the white comfort or the white community is able to take comfort that if their system prevails, they can continue to be as mediocre as they have been always allowed to be in comparison to those of us who have been forced to be excellent, and that will provide them some sort of comfort. It's not going to be enough in this day and age to just think about the executive orders, to just think about the policies, to just think about the ways in which government is screwing up what to all of us looks like, man, y'all really making it hard for everybody out here. Because if you don't understand the psyche of whiteness and the psychology of keeping white people who cling to that psyche intentionally ill-informed, they were doing it in the 1600s. Fox News just perfected it today, but this is their project. This is how they move through the world. And now that the billionaires and the white nationalists have decided we should have open conversations about race and it sort of freed everybody up, we're going to have to continue having open conversations about race. And that is going to require for us understanding what is driving white psyche. I want to also mention before we go to commercial break and welcome in Imani Gandhi, one thing briefly. We used to have a book club on the Lurie Daniel Favor Show. And it was like in our first year or so. And in my actual job at my law center, we are going to be launching a book club in February. And I am going to offer up to you the opportunity to join in a book club. We already have FUBU February planned, where we here in Urban View are planning to buy as much Black as we can for FUBU February. But I want to add an opportunity for us to expand our knowledge about these things. And so the first book that we are going to offer is one that most of y'all probably have, but we're going to return to the text. Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy is going to be the book club selection that we're going to look at through the month of February. We're going to be going a couple of chapters at a time, and we're only going to do like maybe one day a week where we can kind of focus in on the books. We were talking about this with the team a bit, but the first book we're going to look at is Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, because as much as I'm going to explain to you what I can in the limited amount of time that we have about the psyche of whiteness, it is also very important that we understand what is formulating our psyche as well. And I need somebody to write a treatise in the way that Dr. Joy DeGruy did on post-traumatic slave syndrome. Post-traumatic enslaver syndrome is another thing that we're going to have to grapple with. I don't know who's doing the research there, but hopefully we'll get a chance to get some of that as well. We got to go to commercial break. Imani Gandhi is joining us. Much more to come here on the Lurie Daniel Favor Show. And if you're on YouTube, please like and subscribe and share the information. We appreciate y'all. Much more to come. We'll be right back after this.